Welcome to the Peaceful Parenting Podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Rosensweet, mom of 3 young people, peaceful parenting coach, and your cheerleader and guide on all things parenting. Each week, we'll cover the tools, strategies, and support you need to end the yelling and power struggles and encourage your kids to listen and cooperate so that you can enjoy your family time. I'm happy to say we have a great relationship with our 3 kids. The teen years have been easy and joyful, not because we're special unicorns, but because my kids were raised with peaceful parenting. I've also helped so many parents just like you stop struggling and enjoy their kids again. I'm excited to be here with you today and bring you the insight and information you need to make your parenting journey a little more peaceful. Let's dive into this week's conversation. Hey all, welcome back to the Peaceful Parenting Podcast. Today's episode is a really fantastic conversation with my guest, Dr. Lynyetta Willis. We had so much fun. We laughed. Sometimes you just meet someone and you have just a really great connection from the start. Well, that's how we each felt, and we vowed to keep in touch. It was just such a really helpful conversation. As a psychologist and family empowerment coach, Dr. Lynyetta Willis helps frustrated families stop stable misery cycles or unhelpful patterns that keep them stuck so that they can create more joy in their parenting or partnerships. Her Trigger to Transformed parent coaching program has helped parents all over the world to confidently deal with their triggers so they can pass on the best parts of themselves and enjoy parenting more. If your ears perked up when you heard the word stable misery, you are in luck because that is what we discussed. And I think a lot of us can relate to that right now as we're coming out of COVID. It's been a tough couple of years. Dr. Lynyetta and I talked about what stable misery is, and she also shared with us her PATHS framework, which is a 5-step framework for getting out of stable misery. I learned so much, and as I said, I laughed a lot. We had a lot of fun with this conversation. Before we meet Dr. Lynyetta, I just want to invite you to leave a question for me. You can record a voice note or voice memo for me on my website, sararosensweet.com. If you find the podcast tab, pretty close to the top of that page, you will find a place that says record a question for Sarah. I would love to answer your questions on the podcast. So please find your way over to my website, sararosensweet.com, go to the podcast tab and find the place where you can hit a button, record a question for me, and I might answer it on the podcast. I would love to hear what you need to know right now and hopefully answer your question in an upcoming episode. So let's dive in and meet Dr. Lynyetta. Hi, Dr. Lynyetta.
Hello, Sarah. How are you?
Good. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, me too. So can you just tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do and how you came to do this work, family empowerment coach?
Yes. So I am trained as a psychologist. I had a private practice for a number of years, and now I do family empowerment coaching, helping families all over the world to, I like to put a caveat, help frustrated families all over the world to break free from what I like to call stable misery in their parenting and in their partnerships so that they can create more joy, have partnerships with people that they want to grow old with, and have relationships with their children where their children actually want to come home after they leave for college. They want to come home for the holidays and want to pick up the phone when you call.
Love that. That's important.
Right.
Great. And you have 2 kids, and we were just talking off the air. They're 10 and 13. So you're right in the thick of it with all of the people that you work with.
Oh, yeah.
Well, okay. Stable misery. I'm intrigued. Can you tell us about what is stable misery?
Yeah, it's a phrase that I coined and I've used for almost 20 years now, where it's that space where nothing is wrong. Like the house isn't burning down. There's no major crisis going on. But as parents or as partners, we don't feel fulfilled. We're not happy. It's the same Groundhog Day situation over and over, and not the good Groundhog Day with the picnics and the lawn games, like the really annoying, boring Groundhog Day. So it's that space where a lot of my families find themselves. And it's that question, like, how did I get here? Where in their partnerships, they go from soulmates to roommates. As parents, they sometimes dread engaging their kids, right? Or find that they're just not sure what to do anymore. And they kind of just they start parenting on autopilot. And when you think back to most of us, when we decided to do this parenting thing for real, we thought about the joy and the happiness, and there's going to be down times, but I got this, right? And it's not mirroring that. The reality doesn't mirror that.
What I always think about is like, I always say we didn't have kids just to move them through the schedule and like,
Right.
get them teeth brushed and bring them to soccer practice. Like, of course, that's part of parenting, but if there's not more than that, it can feel, as you say, like that stable misery or one thing they threw around a lot in the pandemic, which seems synonymous to me, is that languishing term. Have you
Mm-hmm.
heard that when people talked about that in the pandemic? Like, you're just kind of
Yeah.
like, I'm just kind of going on and not thriving, but also not like everything's falling apart or the house is burning down, as you say.
Exactly. And when we're in that space, sometimes it's people tend to not do anything because it's like, well, I don't really have anything to complain about, right? All my
Mm-hmm.
needs are met. The kids are fine. We're fine. There's nothing wrong.
We're not in Ukraine.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. Right. So people just kind of exist in that space. But what I help people to see is that you don't have to.
Okay, so first of all, how do you recognize when you are in that space of stable misery? Like, what are some signs of it? Is it
Right.
similar to
Right.
burnout? Is it similar, do you think?
Somewhat similar. Burnout often has a lot of physiological components to it that stable misery might not have. Right. So sometimes, in terms of, if we look at it from a nervous system perspective, I'm a bit of a neuro nerd, we'll enter into stable misery to keep from burning out. Right. It's sort of like where we go to, it's like when your computer sleeps,
Mm-hmm.
instead of just running all the time. It's like we just kind of go into that, which is interesting because if you think about it from that perspective, stable misery is actually a protective state.
Mm-hmm.
Right. It helps us to survive and keep going.
Are you a polyvagal theory neuro
I
nerd?
love
So,
polyvagal
so would
theory.
it be like dorsal vagal?
Mm, it can, but that's where it sort of gets. So some people, when they're in stable misery, they can absolutely be in dorsal vagal, or what I call like the blue zone.
Right. Or some people know it as freeze, of the fight, flight, or freeze. It's like the freeze.
Yeah, but you can be in stable misery and be in that red zone. So it's, or what I call the fight flight space. And so what it is it's just this consistent, continual way of being that doesn't bring satisfaction, joy, or fulfillment into your life. Right. And you're just existing. So you can be in stable misery. Like I always tell couples, I thought when I bring up that phrase stable misery and they're like, well, we're fighting all the time. And I'm like, are you experiencing joy, fulfillment, or satisfaction? Anyway, no, well, that's probably stable misery, So you can be revved up all the time and still feel like, oh, now if you stay there long enough, absolutely you might fall into that dorsal or that blue space because you get to that point where your nervous system just crashes and it's like, I can't sustain that level. And so what I find with a lot of the people that I work with is they ping pong between red and blue, red and blue, red and blue all day. And that ventral place, like that's more of a, what I call purple. I can use all the polyvagal terms, but I find colors are so much more easy for me. So, and red and blue make purple. So that purple space, that's that space where we love to live, where it's that calm, productive, relaxed, I'm on top of this, I got this space. Now, more than likely, we're not going to live there 24/7 because that's just not how the world works and not how our nervous systems work. But a lot of times we're in stable misery, that purple space becomes very narrow, or we just don't visit it very often as individuals or as a family. We say families are systems too. And so as a family, sometimes we're in red or we're in blue, right? And so there are ways even to widen that purple zone of your family, but it starts with helping ourselves to do it.
Okay, so how do we do it?
Yeah. Well, I created this framework. It's a 5 paths framework. And I use it in a program that I created called Triggered to Transformed, which helps parents who want to raise their kids differently from how they were raised, but struggle to be overreactive and continue those unhelpful cycles and patterns. And it works really well with recognizing and starting to extricate yourself rather from that stable misery cycle.
Okay.
Now, the first thing I want to say about stable misery is it's not an on-off switch. It's more like a dimmer switch. Okay? And if you think about a dimmer switch, at the top of it is, I would put dynamic joy, right? When the lights are full on, bright, everything's going well. And at the bottom is stable misery, where things are very dim and dark. The idea isn't to be in dynamic joy all the time. That sounds wonderful. I'm not sure how to do that without illicit substances, though.
I was just going to say drugs, but Okay, we're not
You
promoting
figure that
drugs on
out.
this podcast.
Exactly. You figure out how to do that without drugs. Send me that interview. I will listen all day long. So the idea isn't to be there all the time, but it's to use that dimmer switch idea as an indicator. Okay, so my husband and I, we were stuck in stable misery for a number of years. And so that dimmer switch was in the off space. It's not that we don't ever move in that direction, but now when we do, we recognize it. So the first step is to recognize, what does stable misery look like for me? What does it look like for us? What does joy look like for me or us as a family? And once you have those two bookends, then you can start using stable misery and dynamic joy as indicators, as opposed to, let's get out of stable misery. Let's run.
So for figuring out what it looks like for you, do you have any like suggestions? Do people like brainstorm when they felt joy, or how do you develop that scale for yourself?
Yeah. You know what's interesting? I have never said the phrase stable misery to someone and without getting a look of, oh.
Yeah, no,
right?
When I heard it, I was like, oh yeah, I know that. I know
Yes.
that feeling, especially with the pandemic. Like, I think we all were so limited and lost maybe temporarily, but lost a lot in the pandemic. And I think it's really common. I think it's probably more common now than it was 2.5 years ago for people to be in stable misery. Is that what you are finding?
I find that 100% to be accurate, because we don't know how to exist without, it completely switched the way we are. And so our normal habits and the normal things that we do that we didn't even recognize to regulate ourselves and to help ourselves feel more at peace and more connected with those we love, a lot of those were taken away. Like, for instance, coming home from work and that drive in the car. Right? That is such a decompression space for so many people that people didn't realize until there was no more drive in the car. And it was literally like, I'm working, I open the door and there's the family, and it's like.
I was talking to a dad yesterday who had that exact realization. He said, I've been going back to the office and I hadn't realized how much that ride on the subway and then the 6 or 7 minute walk through my neighborhood allowed me to switch gears from work to home. And I'm like being such a better dad now because I'm not just, running back to my desk in between things with the kids or whatever. Like I can actually put work away. So I love that you brought that up. It's that buffer, right? That we all have been missing.
And we don't always know. We don't know because we naturally naturally integrate that into our schedules. Like, our nervous system is always going to seek ways to find those buffers and those points of relaxation. And so we don't even realize that we developed those habits until they were no longer there. And because we didn't realize they existed, it wasn't like we said, oh, I need something to put in the place of that, subway ride. Like it was just, I'm feeling horrible and awful. And when I don't want to open the door at 5 o'clock, I just want to pretend I have extra meetings because I know I'm going to get handed a baby or I'm going to have to cook something or, and so it's like, and then that creates tension. Like when I work with couples, I hear that a lot around, this idea of one partner, I see this a lot. One partner will have subconsciously figured it out. Right. And be like, oh, I'm going to game. I'm going to, do all and then the other partners like that hasn't figured out how to integrate that into their life, feels like they're carrying the mother load of I'm doing the dishes and I'm doing the laundry. I'm doing and so there's this lopsided sense of commitment, and which leads to resentment, which leads to more frustration and anger, which leads to disconnect, and it creates this huge additional cycle of pressure. I found that the pandemic often it created problems, but even more than that, it just like cream rising to the surface. It just really magnified things that were already existing.
Yeah, you couldn't get away from it.
Exactly. But the paths model. So, because you asked about how do we do this?
We digress.
Okay. I know. It's so easy. So PATHS is an acronym, PATHS, and the P stands for what I was talking about earlier. It stands for perspective. And perspective consists of 2 parts. The first part is figuring out where you are, right? Which means, what are the 2 ends of that dimmer switch for you? Developing a vision. So figuring out where you are That's figuring out like, what does stable misery look like for me? And like I said, I've never said that phrase to someone and they not automatically had a physical sensation or an immediate thought, right? So if you just connect it to the sensation, take time to really sit and be like, sit with that sensation. Like, what does stable misery feel like for me? And when can I remember being there? It might not even be right now. You might have to go back earlier in your relationship or earlier in your life, right? But get some general ideas about what that looks like for you and how you know you're there. And then on the other end, what does joy look like for you? And I find that this one actually is harder for people than the stable misery, right? Because we don't know what purple looks like for us anymore because we ping pong so much. So when I say people are like, well, what does joy feel like in your body? What does joy look like in you? I get this blank stare. What do you do for joy? Nothing, And so that might be the one where people have to sit for a minute and say, what does dynamic joy look like for me? What does it look like for my partnership if you're partnered? And what does it look like for my family as a whole? What things bring us joy? Because I always say, if you don't know where you're going, anywhere will do, So you need to know what that looks like. And it could be something very simple. We laugh more. When we're in that joyous space, we laugh more. Okay, now we can start backfilling in what makes you laugh. So getting really clear on what's that vision, what's that framework look like for me. The other part of perspective is stories. Oh my gosh, the stories in our head, man, they will bring us bliss or bombshells every time. It's just one of the two. So figuring out, what are your stable misery stories? When you're in that stable misery pit, what stories do you tell about yourself or about your child or about your partner, right? Because those stories will absolutely exacerbate that sense. And usually they're stories of powerlessness or hopelessness or helplessness, right? And they're often those red zone stories around, or blue. So it's either things like that lead us to need to like lash out, like, oh, you're being so manipulative and I can't stand that, and those types of stories, or I'm powerless. There's nothing I can do. This is hopeless. I give up. Those are more of those blue zone or those dorsal stories.
When my oldest son was in high school, he was really not he didn't love school, let's put it mildly. And he was sort of halfway through high school and just hate school. And I said, look, you could quit. Like, you're old enough. You could quit school if you want. You don't have to finish high school. And I honestly meant that. Like, I think there are other paths to joy and success in life besides academics.
Especially nowadays.
But he thought about it and he was like, no, I want to have a high school diploma. Like, I want to finish high school. And that really shifted things for him because he got out of powerlessness when he thought, I could stop. Like, I don't have to keep going to high school if I don't want to. I could stop. And then that, I find that sort of shift really powerful where you think, I'm choosing to be here. Anyhow, just a thought on perspective. I think that's in that story that you tell yourself. For him, it was like, I have to be here. And then it was shifted to, I'm choosing to be here. Yes. And that totally changed things for him.
I love that because he went from, this is being done to me to I'm doing this for me. Right? Which is a much more empowered place to exist, for sure. I love that so much. And then you got buy-in too, right? It was no longer you dragging him. It's like, now, dude, this is on you. And he's like, all right, I'm committed. Right? And now you're a helper. You're a coach. You're somebody that, as opposed to like the warden who's like dragging him out and locking him in school every day.
Totally.
So I love that so much.
So perspective, that looking at the dimmer switch of where are we on between stable misery and joy, and then the stories that we're telling ourselves about where we are.
Exactly. And sometimes even what stories could we tell ourselves instead that feel more purple, that feel more, in alignment with that joyful end of the spectrum. The A stands for awareness. Now, I find that especially those of us who are breakers, as I like to call us, those who want to break intergenerational cycles and habits, we tend to need to stay here for a while. So awareness is largely self-awareness. So awareness of our feelings and our body sensations. So if you're anything like me, I was raised with the 4 horsemen mindset view of parenting, and the 4 horsemen are pain, blame, shame, and avoidance. Those were the the ones that were called in. And, that's not to shame my caregivers. It was just how they were raised and how their caregivers were raised, right? Like we use things like corporal punishment and blaming and shaming and emotional manipulation. That's how you kept kids in line. So I was raised to believe that feelings were liabilities and just really annoying things that got in the way, especially vulnerable or sad feelings, right? So things like stop crying before I give you something to cry about. It's like, well, if I'm crying, then maybe, okay, I guess this is wrong then, right? Or anger was okay, as long as it wasn't directed at the caregivers, right? So for me and for a lot of people that I work with, learning to switch from this idea of my feelings are actually, and my body sensations are actually an ally. They're actually signposts that help guide me in where I am and where I need to go or where I want to go, as opposed to looking at them as liabilities or enemies. That is a huge shift that has to be made. So we often spend a lot of time here, and that's where a lot of the nervous system regulation, like in Triggered to Transformed, different ways of regulating our nervous system. It's a whole module all about rewiring our brain, rewiring our nervous system for that more purple arena, and getting clear on what do you feel in your body? What do you experience emotionally when you are in stable misery? What do you feel in your body? What do you experience emotionally when you're moving towards that joy?
Do you have any exercises or like tips for how, if people have been in the habit of not being in touch with their feelings and don't have that awareness, do you have, I don't know, something to get us started with working on that?
I do. So at the end, if you go to parentingtriggerscore.com, there's a quiz there.
We'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah, but one of the things that you're going to receive, so I'm talking about the red zone and the purple zone and the blue zone. I'm actually going to send you a map that I created that outlines what that is. And what I guide people to do, and this is straight out of Triggered to Transform, we literally spend time monitoring your zones. So put this chart up somewhere in your house, and maybe even set an alarm on your phone just to check in with yourself. Or maybe you do it during certain things, like when you get up and you're brushing your teeth. What zone am I in right now? Right? Red, purple, blue. How do I know? Well, I'm in blue because, my shoulders feel really heavy and my stomach's kind of turning. And okay, it doesn't even have to be, I'm not talking about sitting down and doing, because a lot of times what people expect me to say is, you sit down and you meditate. Meditation is actually a very advanced skill. I'm like, how about we just focus on what's coming up for us first at any given point in the day? Pick a time, anytime, right? Right before we sit down for 20 minutes and stare at our thoughts. So really, I just suggest that people start monitoring your zones. Am I in purple right now? Am I in blue right now? Am I in red? And not for the purpose of trying to change anything. We're just gaining awareness at that point. Right? So finding times to really tap in and start to notice, what am I feeling in my body? What am I, even what am I thinking, right? If you're in red, what thought is accompanying me right now as I'm like really frustrated with my kid, right? So becoming the explorer is what I suggest.
Okay, cool.
With that. The other thing that's in awareness is noticing how people respond to you. Right? That's another big piece of awareness. So if I'm sitting down and I'm noticing that there are certain times of the day, or like I think these thoughts and I'm noticing my children starting to turn away from me and run away from me, right? Like, so how other people respond to you can also be a good point of awareness and can also give you insight into who you tend to become when you think these thoughts, or when you're in stable misery, or even when you're moving towards joy. Right? So using other people in that too. The T stands for tools, right? I say you're always using a tool. The question is never, am I using a tool? It's always, is the tool I'm using helpful or unhelpful? Right? 5 deep breaths is a tool, and yelling is a tool. They're both tools. One will probably just get you where you want to go a little bit faster.
And you don't mean yelling.
I don't mean yelling.
just to clarify.
In case that needs to be clarified, not the yelling. Spoiler alert. And so once you start to get an awareness of your body sensations and your emotions, once you start tapping, once you're clear on, those ends of the dimmer switch, then you can start thinking about, what tools do I tend to use? when I'm more at the stable misery end of that spectrum? How do I tend to show up for my kids? How do I tend to show up with my partner? Perfectly good example. Last night, my husband and I were watching this show on, I don't know, Netflix, Hulu, or something like that. And it was about race in America. And I'm a Black woman. And I found myself getting so triggered. Like, I was just like, oh my God, like to the point where, and I could see it happening because I'm watching the show and I'm listening to this guy. And then eventually I turn and I start on my phone. And in my head, I'm like, I am so escaping right now because I've hit my limit. But in that moment, for some reason, I didn't want to tell my husband, can we stop right now? Like, I don't know why. He was really into it. And I didn't want to, I could have done tons of things, but I didn't. So what ended up happening, we got in the bed and we have one of those sleep number beds that the top comes up. And he was like, can you put my side of the bed down? Because I had pulled his up. And I said, is the app not on your phone anymore? And he looked at me like, ooh.
Where did that come from?
I know. And I realized, oh, I'm red zone. I'm in my red zone. And when I get into, and I know that because when I get into my red zone, I get snarky. I get snarky and really annoyed really easily. And I didn't say anything, but as I'm talking about this, I'm like, when he comes home today, I need to be like, that was not you. It was totally me.
I'm sorry.
I know. I'm sorry. I was totally red. Had nothing to do with you. It had everything to do with that show. Maybe we shouldn't watch that right before bed anymore and watch it in doses. So like things like that, realizing what do you tend to do when you're in those different spaces. And that might take time. Like I've been working on this for quite a while, a couple decades now. You know, no, it's not going to take, it didn't take me that long. I want people to think like, oh gosh, are you kidding me right now? But I wasn't working on this intentionally. So if you start working on it intentionally, I promise you it's not going to take you 2 decades. Just
good.
It can take you literally a week to really get into the habit of monitoring your zones and realizing the tools that you tend to use with your kids or with your partner. And then start implementing new tools, right? So now with that example, now what I'll probably do is, like I said, say, let's not watch that at night anymore. Let's not, right? Because now I have power and insight. The H stands for healing. And this is the one where we need to Airbnb for a while, probably. Because all the other things, the stories, how we respond in our bodies, the tools we use, all of those, like they didn't just come out of thin air, right? A lot of times those tools and the thoughts and all of that came from either our childhood or they were modeled for us or we experienced them, or they're coping resources that we've developed over time to deal with certain things, like me going to my phone and escaping the moment, right? So I always say stressors need to be honored, triggers need to be healed.
What's the difference?
Yes. So when you're being triggered, that is a sign that your past is impacting your parenting or your partnership. All right. So that means that something that happened long ago, in my childhood is bubbling up right now. And I'm reacting to this present moment as if it's that past thing.
We know that because everyone's triggers are different. So like what triggers you might not trigger me and vice versa because of our histories and our experiences.
100% nailed it. Yes. And so getting clear on that is really important because those need to be healed. So you can meditate, you can take 5 deep breaths, you can do all the things that you in the world. But if your reaction is linked to a trigger, you need to deal with that trigger, or else you're basically just slapping Band-Aids on top of a big, huge gaping wound, and it's not going to work out too well. Right. So really figuring out, and I'm not talking about 50 years of therapy either. You'd be surprised at how many of my clients, just from making the connection, transforms how they respond. I use this example a lot. I was working with a family where the parent would react every time their child would turn towards the other parent for comfort. And what we realized through our work together was this particular parent grew up in a very neglectful environment. 4 horsemen were all in, out, everywhere throughout that home. And so when their child would turn away, it would activate that like 8-year-old. Because I even said to them, I said, the way you're describing this to me, this feels like a response that an 8-year-old would give. And it was interesting because then they were like, oh my gosh. And was able to connect that and then realize this has nothing to do with my child. It has to do with my fear of rejection and abandonment. And just that awareness and insight and realization shifted how they responded, because now they're able to give themselves compassion and they're able to grasp on to something and do something as opposed to just being
Well, and back to the P of your paths, the perspective changed once that person realized what was going on for them. They could change the story that they were telling themselves about their child's behavior and heal that trigger, right?
Exactly, exactly. And stressors need to be honored because stressors are things that happen in the moment. Like for me, the example with, well, let me use another example because the race one, that's kind of convoluted and complicated because stressors and triggers can overlap. Right? 100%. They can feed each other, like feeding a fire. But if my daughter we're having some struggles with bedtime one night, let's say, and I didn't get a lot to eat that day, or my sleep was bumpy that night, right? And I find myself moving into red or descending into blue. In that moment, it may not be some deep childhood thing. It's like, I need to eat and sleep.
Your
Right?
resources are low.
Right? So in that moment, it's my present state is impacting my parenting, right? So triggers, your past is impacting your parenting. Stressors, my present state is impacting my parenting. So that's the difference. And being able to discern what that looks like for yourself can be really helpful and important.
Mm-hmm.
And one way that you can tell is if it's, and this isn't a foolproof because there are different things that can impact this. But if my child does it on Monday and it's like, not a big deal. I can handle this. I have the resources to be able to deal. And they do it on Wednesday and I want to like throw myself out a window. That's probably a stressor, right? Because the reactions were very different. If I don't care, we could be in the middle of Hawaii on a beach, the most pleasant experience in the world. If my child does that thing, I react the same way every time. That might be a hint that it's a trigger. Yeah. That might be a hint that there's something else. Or if someone else does it, right, it still brings up very similar reactions. That might be a hint that it's a trigger. Again, not fail proof because there are some nuances there, but that may be one thing that people can look at to discern like,
That's cool. I talk about when some of my work is like I have parents track their triggers, and I'm realizing now that probably what I talk about, some of them are stresses and some of them are triggers, because I talk about what are the avoidable triggers, like being late. You can get up a little earlier, you can prepare a little bit better the night before, but then I talk about the unavoidable triggers where back talk, like you can't stop your child from talking back to you, and then that shows that you need to do some healing to look at, like, what is this bringing up for me? What's the story I'm telling myself around this? So that's just it's an interesting parallel, I think.
Yes,
I like that. I like the stresses.
Yes. And that perfect segue, we did not prepare this, by the way, into the last letter, which is self-empowerment. Because when we are just flip-flopping between red and blue and we don't have a grasp on any of these things, it leads us to feel powerless and as if life is happening to us and we have no control over it, right? But in your example, like with the back talk, once I'm clear on who I become in those moments, because that's what all that's about. When you talk about the stories and the emotions and sensations and the tools we use, that is who we become, right? In those moments. Once we have an awareness of that, then we can deal with it. Again, it gives us something to hold on to. Like, oh, okay, I'm becoming that part again, right? Like in Trigger to Transform, we talk about the triggered traveler. Right? We all have triggered travelers. We all have those parts of us that pop up and activate to try to protect us in the moment in the situation. And sometimes we lash out, sometimes they shut us down, sometimes like they have different ways, right? And so once you get a grasp on that and you're like, oh, that's that triggered traveler that tends to pop up and get really snarky, right? Oh, okay. You can realize, oh, that part's activated right now. I can do something about that, right? And that's where you can empower yourself now to say, okay, now I know who I become when my child talks back. You can stay in purple during those moments and you can make creative choices and have creative responses to that situation instead of just reacting in ways that are just going to exacerbate the moment and possibly lead your child to feel disempowered, which just increases the likelihood that they're going to keep talking back.
Mm-hmm.
Because when we're in red or blue, those are areas where we need to protect ourselves. Those zones did not form from an evolutionary perspective millions of years ago so that we could cuddle with the lion. That's not what we were trying to do. They formed so that we could run from the lion or fight the lion, right? Like that's what we want to do. So in those moments when our child becomes the lion, the last thing we're able to do from those spaces is connect. So what you end up doing is you end up fighting from your child or shutting down and turning away, which just exacerbates the moment. In Trigger to Transform, I literally have this image of a lion and then this child like in this mopey situation, and then I kind of like superimpose them. Right? Like when your child's the lion, you don't want to hug the lion. It's not a cute little kitty anymore. It's something that is coming at you to hurt you or, threaten you. It's a threat.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when we're able to sink into the paths and walk the paths, then we're able to stay more aligned with purple, and our child is less likely to become the lion. That's when those things help, like, my child's not giving me a hard time, they're having a hard time, right? When you're in red and blue, none of that makes sense. It's like, no, they're giving me a hard time, right? Like that's the story. That's where you are. But it's when you're able to stay anchored in purple. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't get it. And this is so important. It doesn't mean that you don't get angry. It doesn't mean that you don't feel powerless or shut down. That's not the thing. Our nervous systems do. I still get triggered. Just gave an example, right? And I've been doing this work. But it's about, can I do that? And how long does it take me to find my way back to purple? Or can I stay anchored in purple in these moments? So can I recognize that trigger traveler is activated and still engage from that purple place? Purplish. Doesn't even have to be pure purple. Give me purplish.
Yeah. I always say that self-regulation doesn't mean you never get upset. It means that you know how to calm yourself so that you can respond to your child rather than react out of the upset.
Yes, yes. And that's where that awareness comes in. If I'm aware, I'm getting into a point. I'll tell my kids all the time, I'm getting really agitated. I need a minute. But again, that comes from doing the work around becoming aware and recognizing what zone I'm in. Yes. I can't do that if I don't know who I tend to become when I'm in red or when I'm in blue. I can't do that.
Yeah.
Right. Because then I just react. And then afterwards, when the shrapnel's fall and the fallout's happening, then I'm like, oh, sorry, I blew up again, didn't I? Right. Which again, no shame. Recognizing it after is still awareness.
Yes.
It's still awareness.
And it helps you next time.
Yeah. And then what you'll start to realize is the more you do it, the more you'll start to back it up. And then maybe you'll recognize during. And maybe you can shut it off during, and then you start to recognize it before it happens, right? So it's not about perfection. It's about becoming that explorer, becoming that detective, and having the realizations at different points in time.
When in my membership, we did a workshop recently, befriending your nervous system. And I taught them all about the polyvagal map. And we did the exercise of mapping your nervous system. And a couple people afterwards to me said that was so powerful for them because they'd never before really sat down and thought, like, what does it feel like when I'm in the, to use your terms, what does it feel like when I'm in the red? What does it feel like when I'm in the purple? What does it feel like when I'm in the blue? And they had so little awareness of those different places on their nervous system ladder that just looking at it helped them to be more conscious in their interactions with their kids. Like, oh, I didn't even realize that when my hands start to clench or I get this feeling in my stomach that I'm moving into a reactive state, right?
Yes, 100%. And, it's interesting how much so when I was in private practice as a psychologist, one of my specialty areas is trauma healing. And it's so interesting how much of that I pull into this work, because a lot of trauma healing is about befriending our bodies, befriending our emotions, being able to see how long we can tolerate being in certain spaces within ourselves and actually in the environment, So realizing like after 6 p.m., I'm kind of done as a parent. Like I'm a placeholder at that point. So, having that realization about myself and realizing like, all right, what does that mean? What does that mean about me in terms of how I need to show up? And one of the things we do in Trigger to Transformed is I literally have a module where I literally help people create their own stress management system. Because I'm like, I can give you all kinds of stuff. But the more aware you become of who you are and who you become, you take it away, right? Like, and so guiding them through, like, what do I need in those moments when I become this? How do I navigate and negotiate? And we have this, I call the 1-page stress management system, where it's like literally 1 page. And then you put that up and you start to study it. We are so good at studying all the parent. I mean, you can probably see you can see my bookshelf behind me. I have tons of books. Got a lot of education in this brain, right? Right, exactly. Right. We're really good at studying the parenting books and what all these people say about parenting. And here's the thing. spend some time studying yourself. I promise you that will be way more fruitful than studying 50 million books on how to do parenting. The more aware you become of who you become at different points in this parenting or this partnership process, the more shifts and change you will see, the more transformation you will see in your relationships, because that's what it's all about. It's all about, who do I become and who do I want to become, right? Where am I on that dimmer switch and where do I want to be?
Wonderful. That's a great place to leave it. Oh, thank you so much. This has been so wonderful to speak with you about this. And I know it's going to be so helpful for all of our listeners. And it's really helpful for me too, because I have to say, it's stable misery. Yep, I can relate.
Yes.
So I'm going to ask you the question that I ask all of my guests, which is, if you could go back in time to your younger parent self, what advice would you give yourself?
I think the advice I would give myself is be as present as you can, and it'll be okay, right? Just be as present as you can. Don't beat yourself up when you can't, because that's probably the biggest piece. Because I dance. I don't like to use the word struggle. I dance with anxiety. And for much of my early parenting journey, there was a lot of anxiety around making sure that, not even that I'm doing it right, because I don't believe in right necessarily, but making sure that, like, I'm not missing anything, making sure I'm present enough, making sure, because regret is, I don't want regret, and so realizing, like, just be as present as you can. Every step of the journey comes with new lessons. Your kids are going to be fine. Just be there for them and really focus on that connection. If you can't do anything else, just one thing a day to connect. And that's going to really lend itself to the foundation that you ultimately want to build.
And make you more present, as you just said. Yeah, I love that. Thank you so much. Can you tell everyone where we can find more about you and what you do and what you offer?
Yeah. So I'm on Instagram and Facebook, but the best place to go for me, honestly, is to the parenttriggerscore.com, because that will get you in my vortex.
Okay.
And you'll get more information about the paths. You'll get more information about the zone experiences. And also, what you'll do first is you will take this amazing quiz that helps you figure out who you tend to become during those triggered moments. I've actually had people write me and say, yeah, that moment when you feel called out by an online quiz, right? Like, so it's really helpful and insightful and helps you on that initial step to your journey around walking the paths.
Awesome. I'm going to take the quiz. I'll let you know what my result was.
Please.
And we'll link to that site you just mentioned in the show notes for anyone who's driving or something and can't remember. They can go back and check it out. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode. I hope you found this conversation insightful and exactly what you needed in this moment. Be sure to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platform and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. Remember that I'm rooting for you. I see you out there showing up for your kids and doing the best you can. Sending hugs over the airwaves today. Hang in there. You've got this.